Welcome to Policy Beyond Politics, the weekly show which discusses public policy issues and concerns. This is a very rational, nuanced, apolitical discussion which is totally different from our prime time TV debates. Today I am joined by Dr. Vijay Sakhuja, the leading expert in international relations, and today we are going to discuss the recent statement by State Secretary Mike Pompeo on the Chinese incursions and also the US grand strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. Welcome to the show, Dr. Vijay Sakhuja, the Distinguished Fellow of Center for Public Policy Research. Today we are going to discuss the statement by Mr. Mike Pompeo, the State Secretary of the United States. He, in his interaction with the American Enterprise podcast, he said when the question was asked about India-China border dispute and the territorial issues, he said, these are the actions by the authoritarian regimes, and we've been seeing from China for the last so many years. Now, in that context, this conversation we are trying to build today is about America's grand strategy in the Indo-Pacific or in the Asia-Pacific, in this region. With a statement from the Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, on Chinese Communist Party. Actually, he was referring not China. He kept on mentioning Chinese Communist Party of China. And I think this is a reiteration from the State Department on the US interest in Asia and Pacific. So, sir, could you elaborate on the strategic thinking of the US Defense Department in this region, in the context of this statement, and also some of the recent developments, some of the recent policy initiatives taken by the Defense Department of the United States of America?
Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I think we are in midst of very interesting times, rather I must say, very turbulent times as far the seas and oceans are concerned. Although by all measures we would find that in the corona period, not much of activity which is taking place on the oceans, but Pacific waters have been quite turbulent, and we've seen an enormous amount of military activity concerning the United States as part of their broader interest in the Pacific Ocean. And of course, this is also being equaled in those many terms by the Chinese, who are also proactively engaged in South China Sea or East China Sea, in waters in the Pacific Ocean, and trying to not match, but at the same time confront the Americans in their own simple ways, etc., etc. But at the heart of all this lies is US's greater interest in the Pacific, which I notice a very distinct trend. The 2017 Indo-Pacific Strategy, which was brought out, was very clear. It had a very broad sense of what the Indo-Pacific meant. That means for them, in a very, very interesting way, and a very pleasant and way, they would call it Hollywood to Bollywood, which took fancy, by many scholars, partly in the context of Indian for strategic thinkers, who said this is a large space and but there were also some inhibitions about the geographic or cartographic imagination of the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. For them, it was for east of Africa, for Indians particularly east of Africa, going all the way to the Pacific, and there's the Pacific Island nations, because India has interest in the Pacific Island Nation Forum. Besides, notwithstanding the so-called the stitching of geographies of the two of the strategic thinking amongst the United States and those in India. But this was a large space, and we all began, the discourse, as a matter of fact, has its genesis going back 2012, 2013, when the whole idea came about from the Australians, who said two ocean strategy, and they called it the Indo-Pacific. It made a lot of sense. At the same time, we were also given a very nice flavor of confluence of the seas from the Japanese. So there was a resonance of sorts to suggest that Indo-Pacific is the geographic space that we were talking about. But if one looks at it, Genesis, it had a very strong strategic element, and thereafter a large number of stakeholders who came into to understand the Indo-Pacific, and then it began as essentially a concept called Indo-Pacific, purely in terms of fisheries or migratory fish. It turned into a strategic space. Then people talked about, can we have Indo-Pacific cultural exchanges? Today we are talking about Indo-Pacific concept in the context of COVID response, pandemic response. So it has taken a very wide definition. Suffice to say, Indo-Pacific remains, and the flavor of the time is on strategic element, and that's what I'm going to focus on. And since 2006, 2013-14, we were first introduced by the United States what they called as Indo-Asia Pacific. They didn't want to leave the concept called Indo-Pacific, Asia Pacific. And if you see the bill that was introduced in the Congress, U.S. Congress, the bill was labeled as Indo-Asia Pacific. Thereafter, it got mutated to read as Indo-Pacific, which became, because that was the prevalent terminology, and the Indo-Pacific strategy came about. And Indo-Pacific strategy was, if one read it very carefully, it had a geographic space, what we called as Hollywood to Bollywood, or rather Hollywood to Bollywood, but it had a very interesting tone of strategic element. And for over there are lots of issues. The menu was rich in terms of, and within this broader Indo-Pacific, we also came across something called as quadrilateral security dialogue. I would term QSD as QSD 2.0 because the first QSD had already started way back 2007, when the second series of Malabar exercises were held in 2007 within that year, and there were 4 navies plus Singapore who joined in. And then again 2007, when you go back again, trying to look at QSD, again it was Philippines that time the APEC meeting was on when this whole concept was again reintroduced. So I would call it QSD 2.0. So there is a certain element of continuity which is gone. The concept has been there. It has gone down for a while for various reasons. Australians saying we don't want to be part of it because there were pressures from China. Japan had its own reasons. India was not very sure whether they want to push a narrative which would be titled, which will be focused on China. So each one had it, but today the focus is very much on China. And thereafter, when you look at focus on China, the strategic geography of the United States military, for that matter, or United States, is the Pacific. I would call this space as a Western Pacific Ocean, or the Western Pacific Rim. Now, within this Western Pacific Rim, you would find that much of the strategy documents are focused. A number of issues which are coming up here, they range from conceptualizing the idea, bringing out new terminologies. So today, what we'd call as, what would be in ASEAN terms, alphabet soup. But here we are talking about is not alphabets, it is solid words which are making up concepts like Pacific Deterrence Initiative, distributed maritime operations, the strategy towards, we're talking about something called as US Maritime Superiority 2.0. It is not in terms of alphabet soup because that was the flavor of the time. Here we got solid conceptualization with the US is thinking. The US believes that the center of gravity of their engagement will be the Pacific Ocean. They, of course, they have taken the initiative of renaming the PACOM, or in Hawaii to read as Indo-PACOM, for that matter. They do take note of that this is a large space. By all counts, today when I look at it, I think the focus is on the Western Pacific Ocean. Now, within this broader Western Pacific Ocean, you find that there are a number of issues which are coming up. Concepts like Hawaii, Guam, and then Hainan. If you follow an axis, and Okinawa or no, you find that the Americans are now pushing on both hardware in terms of infrastructure, in terms of materials, in terms of platforms, as also in terms of conduct of operations. They've had a number of engagements in this region in terms of, or show of force, what they call as Elephant Walk Guam, deployment of bombers from Alaska, right? Putting out a large number of aircraft to run through the region. And this has become a feature. think last month, in 1 week, we've had about 7 to 8 instances that the US aircraft have individually, collectively, in terms of groups of 4 to 5 or different varieties, including bombers, have been floating around. For the US, they find that it is just not just the major platform that they want to build their whole force structure on. They have concepts called as bringing in unmanned aviation, unmanned surface vessels. And they've been trying out these. So one sees a kind of a focus of the United States military running towards the Pacific Ocean. Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific is important, yes, but within the Indo-Pacific, what would be useful for the United States right now is looking at focus is on the Pacific. This is how the entire scenario is building up. Maybe let me share with you some statistics in this regard. Today, the U.S. Navy has a total of about 297 vessels. That is financial year 2020. They're looking to go up to 314 vessels to 355 vessels by 2034. Now, if one were to look at these figures and pit these against the Chinese, who have a large number, they're not dwarfed by the Chinese numbers, but in the long run, one finds that there is a certain amount of lead, or the Chinese Navy may have taken a little edge purely in terms of numbers. The quality remains an issue which needs to be debated. And if a quick read of the numbers in the case of the Chinese would be that in the last 5 years, say 2014 to 2019, they added 52 vessels. And they're currently at about 360 vessels, projected to grow to 400 watches by 2025 and 400 by 2030. Right. Now, this will be, if one looks at it, say 2035, 30, the Chinese Navy would have, I think, about 50 vessels more than that. But what we find is that the US is also investing a lot in technological developments. I would put my neck out and suggest that the US still enjoys a very strong technological edge over the Chinese Navy. They've been investing in large number of technologies. It is not surprising to see DARPA, one of the leading organizations which is into research and development, is producing one of the top of the line projects. A variety of hardware is coming out. And this brings in the concept of distributed maritime operations in the context of the United States. So US strategy, warfighting strategy, would need to be watched very carefully. What does it mean? Where does it fit in terms of pitted against the Chinese? One thing for sure is that unlike the Chinese, United States military or US Navy has a rich experience in having gone into combat, conducted operations, whether it be the Gulf. I think they've done a great job over there. All right. They've been all over. And it is not surprising that they now fielded, after 3 years, 3 carriers in the Pacific. And adding icing on the cake was that they even carried out 2 carrier operations that is joint. That is the kind of pressure which is coming in terms of US strategy, military hardware, thinking, and the focus.
So what about the PDIs, I mean, Pacific Defense Initiative taken by the State Department?
Yeah, PDI is Pacific Deterrence Initiative is essentially, they've drawn, as a matter of fact, a leaf out of what they had for the European Defense Initiative that was targeted against Russia, that was focused in Europe. And for Pacific, they've got the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Now, under this, there is a number of subsets within this initiative: infrastructure development, reinforcing, let's say, high altitude area defense for, say, Guam. Now, Guam is most vulnerable in the US thing. It is very much within the range of what the Americans call as Guam killers, DF-21. They were the carrier killers. They were very much in that range. So the focus is now to create a kind of defense of Guam, as also defense of Hawaii, as also bring in terms of resources. You would have noticed the US yesterday, President Trump also signed the order of removing about 9,000 troops from Europe, and they want to bring in those troops not for anything, because they want to bring it into this theater, because that is where the focus is. So Pacific Deterrence Initiative would encompass things like movement of human resource, building of infrastructure, and a strategy to support that, and above all, where the finances. After they will require money. So they have listed out a certain amount of money for this purpose, and the a parallel image would be um, what has come from the Senate committee is what they call as Indo-Pacific Reassurance Initiative. It is a parallel one. But then the aim of both, the Congress is supporting it, bipartisan. Everybody's on board. The target is China. So we're going to see over the next 3 to 4, 5 years, we're going to see a large amount of investment coming in. So under the PDI, you'll have lots of things which are happening. Probably we'll have to monitor each one of them, etc. As to what exactly, how does PDI, what is the architecture? How does it shape up? Where is it heading? So it will be a subject of great interest to the militaries of, for that matter, nations in the Pacific, particularly in the Pacific, as also for India, because of the broader idea. We are not dismissing Indo-Pacific, so Indians will also need to have a look at what the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is all about.
So, sir, when we discuss China, I think we can't conclude any discussion without figuring the Taiwan and Japan, the whole configuration. So, what is US approach to Taiwan and Japan in this all set of new configuration or reconfiguration they are planning in this region?
See, Taiwan has always been a contentious issue for the between China and the United States. So 1976 Taiwan Relations Act is actually the so-called the foundation on which the relationship, which encourages United States to provide military hardware, to build up certain capacities to defeat any threat coming from mainland China. This has been the so-called the pillar of their relationship. But in recent times, I notice a certain trend that US would like to reinforce the capacities and capabilities of Taiwan through defense. I mean, they've got a package which is already on in terms of providing the military hardware, but recently they are more than happy to supply them a quick supply for defense purposes. What we're going to see is Taiwan will become very, very central between US and China. Chinese, the primary aim, they want to get the mainland back, one nation, historical, a number of issues within that framework. Let's not get into those. We find that Taiwan is central. And here, United States would use it for the purpose of its own strategic, let's say, advantage. And here, would Taiwan be a guinea pig? No, not really. I think it's a win-win for Taiwan, for the United States, and of course, they will remain pitted against. So Taiwan will remain central as a kind of, one would be surprised if one looks at Hawaii, Guam, Taiwan. But Taiwan is so close to mainland China. It is part of that first island chain. And the Americans would not like to go into the first island chain because they must deal at the second island chain or about the Chinese strategy. And they would like to reinforce. Now, they will always be troubling mainland China through small little activities, sending the aircraft which takes off from Okinawa, goes over over Taiwan's over Taiwan airspace and lands up in Thailand somewhere else. Or the ships go close to Taiwan Straits, or they come to the east of Taiwan Straits and carry out exercise. The tankers are there, the bombers are there, the fighters are there, and Taiwan. Would the United States use it as a kind of a forward base? Well, it is vulnerable. They know the vulnerabilities in terms of Taiwan, in terms of being swarmed by a large number of M9s, 11s, and thereafter a series of these missiles which are deployed along the coastline, which fall within the range of, within their range is Taiwan. So they would not be very keen or enthusiastic enough to put lots of defenses in it, but do everything possible to provide to help Taiwan defend against a Chinese invasion, which will not be easy to defend. One must assume that very carefully, because uh, the numbers are not pitted in favor of Taiwan. They'll be swarmed. And the kind of platforms that the Chinese Navy is building, particularly in the context of landing to the large 071 variety of vessels, is phenomenal. That is high priority for them to put ships.
So,
And Japan, sorry, I missed out Japan. Now, Japan is a very, very interesting player. Yesterday, I think we got a very interesting news coming out of Korea too, that they are very much engaged with the United States. There's nothing called as drawdown of forces. Japan is very much part of it, despite the domestic anger over all those issues which happen over there. And Japan itself is finding itself, it has got a technological edge, but it doesn't have a quantitative edge. Would Japan join in with the United States? Again, it will be part of, to my mind, would be a part of the broader part of the QSD, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, in which these members would come in. I would also suggest, in looking at the trends that are there, that the focus of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue members would shift towards the Pacific. Australians would come in. They've just announced a larger share for the defense budget, that is just 2 days ago. So you find that at least 3 members of the Quad are primed to work together with the United States, and they may narrow the geography of their operations in terms of training exercises, conduct or for the purpose of signaling, will be the Pacific Ocean. In this context, would India fit in? Yes, it does make sense after some very unpleasant experience with the Chinese on the Himalayan border. There is every reason for the Indian Navy to think about a more aggressive posturing in the South China Sea. It is, if one goes into the strategy document, the South China Sea region is the secondary area of interest. Probably they'll have to rework on it to read as primary area of interest because of this incident which are happening. And in the times to come, in the months to come, we should anticipate that there will be greater number of, or larger number of engagements involving at least the navies and the air forces to join together. We've seen the P-8I, which is a maritime patrol aircraft, being used for at the line of actual control with China. We've got those reports, and now Twitter handles are always putting out interesting pictures of how P-8I is being deployed. And I also noticed that P-8I, which the American version, is also being deployed, is already deployed in the region. So there is a certain kind of a range, a kind of, let's say, um, a structure could be created in which these platforms operate together, which they have had an experience earlier, but that was purely in terms of the Indian Ocean. But now we should be surprised if they stay themselves from, say, Singapore and come and operate out of in South China Sea, which they've been doing earlier. All right. So it will be a very interesting times ahead, how they push it, how much of pressure can they bring in.
So, before we conclude this conversation, this is what probably the general public is keenly watching on about the tactical moves. We've been discussing grand strategy of the United States of America in this region. Do you think there will be any tactical moves by the Americans if this coercive strategy by the Chinese, they're pushing the neighbors to the wall? So, if that is continuing, do you anticipate any quick, tactical moves in this region that will be led by Americans?
See, we are seeing those signs of sorts. If one looks at the kind of, it all began with Chinese announcing an, AIDs, Air Identification Zone, AIDZ, over, East China Sea first, sounding that they're going to promulgate another ADIZ, sorry, Air Defense Identification Zone coming in for South China Sea. And this must be also connected up with the freedom of navigation operation patrols. These were focused, localized towards South China Sea. Last year onwards, 2019 onwards, the US Navy has now been conducting Taiwan Strait passages. First FNOP, then Taiwan Straits, and then these have been now, the frequency has gone up, both in terms of number of transits, as also in terms of the quality of ships, what are being sent on. The Chinese have been also, they've been very watchful of what's going on. The last year that the Chinese refused the French Navy participation in their international fleet review because they were coming through the Taiwan Straits as part of the so-called the patrol, Taiwan Strait Patrol. So the Chinese are very sensitive to anybody transiting through the Taiwan Straits, which they see as signs of challenging their sovereignty. Now, we should anticipate that the number of transits through the Taiwan Straits will continue. We are seeing the number of transits in the air going up significantly. And if you want to look at the air and the sea part of it, these two are a good recipe, if I may say, for a kind of, let's say, a tension of sorts. But it remains to be seen how far, what kind of diplomatic channels are on the move. Whether the US is very keen to develop a kind of more aggressive posture. Would US fall short, or the US thinking fall short of just signaling? How would the Chinese respond? It is, as of now, the US has been there. They've been carrying out exercises. The Chinese also say we are going to be carrying out exercises. Will these transits, air movement, exercise escalate? So it is not going to happen. But then at sea, things happen very fast. The commanders at sea are always advised to look at the bravado very carefully, but at the same time, there are certain rules of engagement put out by both sides. That is, by the Chinese and by the Americans, who would know when are you going to cross the line. But looking at the way the Chinese have been aggressive, and we've had that incident of one of the aircraft, surveillance aircraft, EP-3 incident, right? And coming close quarters to the US warships in South China Sea, there are tensions, but I guess both sides must have, I'm very confident, must have established a certain rules of engagement. How do you come closer, etc. Although they do enjoy what they call as MMCA, Maritime Military Communications Agreement, way back, or nearly about 15, 20 years ago, which was taken as a confidence building measure. But then I think that document needs to be dusted and put out again in terms of bringing it out as to, is there a provision, what kind of rules of engagement. But your question is absolutely right. I think the thresholds have to be looked at very carefully. To me, right now, the thresholds are still reasonably good, high, but it depends on how much pressures United States puts on the Chinese to, forcing them to break free out of their set of, so let's say, threshold.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sakhuja, for that very informative, very insightful conversation on Asia-Pacific, India-Pacific strategy, and also in the context of Mike Pompeo's recent statement on China-India border dispute. It was very engaging, and I'm very thankful to you. And we look forward to your write-ups, articles on these topics in the coming days. Thank you so much for joining. With this, we wrap up this conversation. We love to hear from you, the feedback on the show. Please share your feedback on my Twitter handle, Dhanuraj. And also you can follow our hashtag Policy Beyond Politics on CPPR India Twitter handle.